Welcome, everyone. The event is now live. John, please take it away.
Thanks, Victoria. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's live Tech Talk, the 3 pillars of successful Azure cloud operations. This event was organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine, and it's sponsored by NetApp, the intelligent data infrastructure company. I'm John K. Waters, editor-in-chief of the Converge 360 Group of 1105 Media, and I'm joined today by Cloud Ops experts Sean Harris, Global Developer Relations Lead for Spot by NetApp, and Microsoft Azure Technology Evangelist Ben Brower. Hi, guys.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Thanks for having us.
How you doing, John?
Let me tell you a little bit about our subject matter experts here today. Sean has spent more than a decade working on a range of cloud-native roles, from principal cloud architect to DevOps engineering lead, where he shifted complex packages and processes into a cloud-first mindset, building secure, highly available systems to enhance the way customers run their businesses. He also has a background in digital forensics and incident response. At NetApp, he advocates for customers to assist the developers and technologists who use Spot by NetApp solutions. Ben has been involved in developing and evangelizing service-oriented architectural principles since his days at HP Labs in 1998. We were just kind of reminiscing about that. During his 25-year career, he has focused on empowering developers and architects to leverage the entire stack to deliver componentized services and support business outcomes while balancing agility with responsibility. He currently acts as an evangelist at Microsoft to espouse the virtues of designing and optimizing workloads that are well architected and managed using Microsoft's patterns and practices frameworks for Azure. These are just the right guys for today's topic, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. But before we get started, I've got to do a little bit of housekeeping here. This Tech Talk is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It will be coming your way in the next few days. Our sponsor has provided some extra resources you won't want to miss. They're available now on your console. At the end of this conversation, we'll have a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. Please type your questions into the Q&A box as they occur to you. We'll do our best to get to all of them. Okay, so it sort of goes without saying that developing a successful cloud operations practice is one of the keys, if not the key, to unlocking the full benefits of Microsoft's Azure Cloud Platform in most organizations. Among other advantages, an effective cloud ops practice increases engineering agility and speed to market, which maximizes the value of your cloud investments. But getting cloud ops right is not easy. As Azure Cloud Operations teams move beyond migration and begin to scale in the cloud, they face a range of challenges, from reining in the cloud spend to bridging the skills gap and maximizing team efficiency. Meeting those challenges requires time, patience, and a solid foundation on which to build an effective practice, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I put together some questions for you guys. I'll let you decide who answers what as we go along. Feel free to jump in. We have a text-heavy audience with us today. And at the risk of insulting them, I always like to start with a definition. And I think maybe one of you guys could define cloud ops for us.
Ooh. Sean, go ahead if you like.
I think
we could get, maybe there's 2 definitions. Let's start with Sean. How would you define cloud ops?
I think cloud operations is the embodiment and understanding of what the cloud is at the end of the day, which is realizing that you're running on somebody else's equipment in somebody else's space, but you're still responsible for the security and the operations behind it. And so cloud ops takes into account all of the aspects of what you have to manage to keep your cloud running. Sure, you can go set up a VM, but the cloud ops part comes in with how do you keep it patched? How do you keep it secure? How do you keep it monitored? All that thought process that has to go in that, just like we do with DevOps. It's that balance of infrastructure and operations that you have to take into account when you're running in the cloud. That's my 5-second elevator pitch that I would give about cloud ops.
I would completely agree, and I think there's another component, which is this is where you really see IT and the developer really begin to merge, along with the business teams. So you'll see a lot of business-oriented people involved in the operations of the workload, the operations of the infrastructure. Because what we're typically seeing is more business outcomes. We're really focused on business outcomes as it relates to how a particular application, how a particular workload is affecting that business outcome. All of that has to do with the way that particular workload is supporting that business outcome and its performance. And so there's a lot of recommendations, there's a lot of expectations, there's a lot of non-functional requirements that also need to be brought into play that a lot of the IT teams may or may not know about. So I think cloud apps is a holistic sort of concept.
That's a great point. That I think when we start adding ops and we start wrapping the business aspect and those business outcomes into our day-to-day stuff, it gives IT a visibility that we haven't had before. Coming from a guy who started in mainline IT ops operations, where there was really little visibility other than how much money I was spending on equipment and resources. With cloud ops, it really opens up that picture, and now the CEO, the CFO, everybody in the company has some view into the outcomes because they're all dependent on the cloud in a way that they didn't realize before the cloud became really ubiquitous like it is now.
That's fascinating. You answered my first question about why it's important for cloud infrastructure visibility and accessibility. But maybe talk about some of the challenges companies face making that happen.
Yeah, so I think... Oh, go ahead, Ben.
No. Sean, let's start with you.
Go ahead.
Okay, we'll get this right. We'll get this.
We'll get it. So my go-to has always been, you don't know, you can't manage and you can't control what you can't see. And cost is an important aspect of cloud ops, right? Like that's the one thing that we talk about when we talk about optimization and whatnot, is how do I control my costs? But knowing what your infrastructure is, who's called it, why it's running is just as important. As it's easy to manage one workload, 5 workloads, even 100 workloads are pretty easy to manage. But when you scale to thousands, 10,000s, 100,000 workloads, or even a hybrid environment, then that challenge becomes harder to know what you're working with, why it's running, and who owns it, and who's going to be the point of it. So that governance and guardrails are really overused terms, but controlling and knowing is key to ensure that you're getting the best value and the best performance out of your workload and protecting them from emerging threats.
Fascinating. Maybe this one's for Ben, since best practices is sort of your wheelhouse. What are some of the best practices for ensuring proper visibility and accessibility in a cloud environment, especially when dealing with multi-cloud or hybrid clouds?
Okay, well, I think the first thing I would start with is to talk about what does a management methodology look like. So I do have a slide here that I'd like to share.
Right.
That I think it kind of grounds the concepts in what is best practices. The slide here is basically describing what we have in our cloud adoption framework, which is the managed methodology. The managed methodology is basically one of 7 different methodologies within the cloud adoption framework. And so what manage is meant to be is a way to describe how cloud operations from a management perspective relates to the business, which then relates to advanced operations below. And so when we think about best practices, one of the most important things is to establish the management baseline. So when someone says establish a management baseline, there's essentially 3 different things, 3 different disciplines to really consider. One is the inventory and visibility. So know what assets you're actually trying to manage. And making sure you have visibility of those assets. So it's basically what Sean was mentioning just before. Then there's notions of operational compliance and protecting and recovering. These are basic concepts that you should have in every single one of your cloud ops principles. And so with with that in mind, once you have those established, and you can establish this through like a landing zone, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, but once you've established a baseline, it's at that point where you can go talk to your business teams to say, okay, we have our landing zone, we have our environment, we have an understanding of how management's going to work. Let's talk about what business criticality means, or what workload criticality means to your workloads. And so the way to do that is actually to go talk to the business teams and say, if this particular application were to go down, what sort of business impact would that have? And that typically will come in the form of things like dollars, users, security, brand erosion. All of those are kind of business metrics or business considerations that will affect or have an IT team or a multidisciplinary team understand what is criticality. Once you have criticality in mind, then you can decide, okay, do I need more? Do I need more than what the management baseline already provides? And it's at that point where you think, well, if I've got a mission critical application where this cannot go down, you need to make sure there's resilience. You need to make sure there's an understanding that in any time this particular application goes down, it doesn't affect the use or the expectation of this particular application. It's at that point where you start to think about things like advanced operations, where you enhance the baseline. You enhance things more than just log analytics. You begin to really think about what does it take to ensure that you have multi-zonal support, making sure that there is BDCR and also other aspects to BDCR. And then finally, you begin to start thinking about what sorts of specializations do you need for the various platforms and the workloads. It's at this stage where you begin to really understand what is kind of the design principles that are aligned with this particular criticality as it relates to other aspects of your workload. So if you have a resilient, highly resilient workload, how does that affect cost, or how does that affect security, or how does it affect performance? So those are all aspects that you also need to take into account. So I'll stop there.
Did you have anything to add, Sean?
No, I think that those two pillars, the business alignment, is especially important, right? Managing production level workloads. It doesn't matter if you're a small, medium business. It doesn't matter if you're an enterprise like Microsoft or NetApp. Those three things, the criticality, the impact, and the commitment, and getting that buy-in and understanding from the business is super, super important, because the way that we approach an outage when you're hosting an application or you're hosting a workload that everybody's depending on and external customers are depending on really comes down to that time to recover and having that a realistic objective while keeping in guidance that people are losing business for every second that they're down, and it's impacting your company's reputation. And so having that buy-in and that understanding and that definition of what success looks like is paramount when it comes to cloud operations.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and I'd like to add one last thing back to the question you asked about best practices. Is it's not easy. You need to have a certain understanding what sort of questions to ask. You need to have an intelligence into understanding what are the things that matter, like what sort of considerations should you have. And so some are going to be fundamental, some are going to be extraneous. And so you need to decide what are the things you need to know, and how do you go about learning about those things. And that's actually where best practices really make a difference, because there have been a lot of people before you who have deployed or have implemented or adopted the cloud. There's a lot of various experts out there that have also a lot of experience. It's that sort of thing where you can go learn about best practices. Those are the sources that you can learn from. And so there's a lot of material out there. The cloud adoption framework is one. There's a well-architected framework. That's another. Every cloud service provider has both of these sorts of documents.
Fascinating. How does
and I would just add on to that. Real quick. Sorry, John.
No.
The well-architected frameworks from the scalers are probably the most useful and for me, even in DevRel, I go back to all the time. And so my recommendation that I give everybody when they come and say, how do I get started? How do I start the optimization journey? And how do I dial in my workload so that it's running at peak performance, is to just know, eat, sleep, and breathe those well-architected frameworks. They're there for a reason. They're time-tested. There's a reason that they're all similar. And becoming an expert in the well-architected framework will guide your cloud ops journey as a practitioner, as a leader of these, so that you're always architecting with those best practices and those well-architected guidelines in place.
Okay, so if we're talking about intelligent automation for cloud ops, how does that impact all this? I mean, you know, automation is on everybody's mind these days, you know, with AI, and it was, and even before that, for the efficiency and, you know, cost savings. How does it impact what we're talking about here today? Let's start with maybe Sean. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to push a slide and talk about it right here. So Great. It starts with those three pillars that we're really talking about today: infrastructure optimization, management and governance, guardrails, if you will, and application services, right? And this is kind of a marketing slide, and I realize that, but it's really hits the point that we talk about when people say, how do I start optimizing my Azure workloads? You have to gain operational efficiency, and you have to have SLAs that you can report back to your business. You can't do it yourself. Engineers are expensive. Engineers are hard to onboard and get trained and up to speed to the point where they're able to run stuff. And so having continuous optimization that's working behind the scenes, that's based on AI and machine learning and can do things at machine speed, will at the end of the day really increase your performance, the availability of your workload, ensure that you're utilizing your resources correctly, and control your cost at the same time. And then when we talk about governance, you have to know who's getting access into your stuff and why. You have to give everybody the full visibility, because you can't make data-driven decisions without having the data in front of you. And so you have to have a way that you're easily able to see and view your entire cloud operations, because you have to take immediate action sometimes, right? You have to go and turn something off and fix something to keep up with a security threat. So you have to stay compliant, but you also have to be accountable to your auditors for your external compliance programs. So you have to do that with minimum effort, because DevOps engineers, platform engineers, and IT leadership are always having to focus on the next big picture. So you've got to have that automation and that continuous optimization in place so that you can do it with the minimum human effort, so that you can have these expensive resources for your organization really dialed in and focusing to be strategic. And then how do you deliver your application, right? You've got to be able to deliver at scale, at speed, and automation's really the only way to do that. And so those are the big topics when we start talking about that optimization and why it's important, just from a baseline level. If you can't see it, you can't manage it. If you don't know who's getting into it, you can't secure it. And if you can't deploy it, you're not doing business.
Fascinating. Ben, did you have anything to add?
I think there's another, coming from patterns and practices. I think another really important area to think about when you're thinking about patterns, for instance, is how can you go about codifying policy? Because when you can codify policy, you're effectively being able to use that policy or enforce that policy across multiple sets of workloads, infrastructure, environments. And so that becomes a really important aspect of making sure that you're setting up your shop correctly. And then once you've done so, you can then begin to scale much more effectively. And that's where a lot of the intelligence begins to really embed itself, because once you've set up your shop, and that can be in lots of different ways, you effectively can do things like chaos engineering. You can start to do things like enforcing policy or looking at certain sorts of alerts for things like platform drift. And these are things that are automatable. They're alert. You can notify and alert on, and they all can fit within certain boundaries or certain bounds. And that all essentially is a part of the notion of intelligent automation.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Okay, so these are the three pillars, of our title here. What are let's talk about some of the tools that you can use to implement intelligent automation in cloud environments. What are some of the tools that you recommend or that you talk about, and how can companies find the right ones? Maybe start with Sean.
Yeah, so my big one what really started my career in cloud ops and where I tell everybody to get started is start learning infrastructure as code. And go into infrastructure as code and turn that and expand that into everything as code, because everything is extendable from APIs, command line, right? There are a number of tools, and we can talk about the individual providers and their benefits and whatnot, but understanding automation and repeatability and being able to do things so that it's done the same way every time, right? Like, if one of the problems that I used to have when I was managing traditional infrastructure teams was I'd have one guy that liked to spin up VMs with a certain set of scripts and do things a certain way, and then I had another guy that liked to do it with all PowerShell versus Bash, right? And so dialing in and coalescing around an initiative to have everything into, I guess we're calling it GitOps, where you're using pipelines and you're using that automation to drive your infrastructure, is that low-hanging fruit that anybody can start with, because there's really a low barrier to entry when it comes to infrastructure as code, right? If you want to play with infrastructure as code, you can learn it from a number of cloud providers with their free accounts and just using their built-in tools. And then you can extend that out to things like Terraform and Pulumi and expanding that out. The next one that I would say when it comes to that infrastructure automation is understand how machine learning works when it comes to remediation and auto healing, and really know what it's doing behind the scenes, so that when it's doing something, you know why and can report why you're trusting this automation to do it behind the scenes, right? It's easy to go to a company and buy their tool and get that tooling, but how many of us have bought tools that we never fully deployed or never fully realized, and it's just sitting there burning budget? So if you're going to buy something, know what it does, make that tooling a strategic. So easy to go spin up a 30-day trial, right, with a credit card or no credit card. A lot of companies don't even require a credit card, or you tack it onto your cloud bill and you forget about it because that didn't work the way that we wanted, and we didn't leverage the resource or have the time to go learn about it. And so knowing what you have running in your environment and what people are able to deploy and connect to your environment is another big piece of it that I think often gets overlooked, right? So you're now bringing governance into the process of your optimization and automation. And then just understanding what your devs are doing, right? We talk about DevOps being that marriage between developer and programmer. And Ben, you made a good point earlier. So much of the way that we look at this has changed because now the IT department is kind of programming, right? We're helping build those pipelines and deliver that code. We might not be writing the code, but we have to know how it works so that we can deliver it if something breaks. It's no longer developers throwing code over the wall and saying, go deploy this. Right. You have to be strategic and partner with it. So you have to understand what your application's doing, how your pipelines are working, and really build into that automation so that there's no one single point of failure at scale.
Fascinating. Ben, what do you think about that?
A couple thoughts about that, and I see some questions in the chat here that I might help answer with this next point. Is one of the things that we do a lot with our best practices is we talk about landing zone or an Azure landing zone, and so Azure landing zones are a concept. They're essentially a way to think about building out a platform that are using shared services. It's a multi-subscription deployment in which you're essentially making sure that there's a blast radius large enough that you're not affecting any one particular service at a time. And so you can create redundancy into the platform pretty easily in that regard. And so when you start to think about all the different types of shared services that are meant to be available to all workloads, you begin to think about things like identity and security and network and partitioning of networks, and thinking about what does a sandbox look like for your DevOps teams? What's a DevOps process looks like outside of that DevOps or outside of the platform? And then finally, there's the notion of what's called an application landing zone, where the application landing zone sits within the reference architecture of that platform landing zone, which is essentially the way you think about a particular workload, how it's supposed to run within the environment. And then if it has certain criticality levels, as I was saying earlier, where you have a mission critical application, it may have additional policy that needs to be applied on top of that baseline, which is effectively what's being deployed or implemented within the platform landing zone. And so the types of tools that you need for deploying these kind of concepts are things like using a landing zone accelerator, where a landing zone accelerator is implemented as infrastructure as code. That is essentially a way to go about using a Terraform template or using a Bicep template that is basically describing different kinds of resources and different sorts of subscriptions that are all essentially part of one template that you can deploy as basically a click of a button. And you can find these things in like our Architecture Center, our Azure Architecture Center, or you can go to Terraform's registry, or you can go to other sorts of GitHub or GitOps sorts of environments where you'll find these sorts of platforms that you can go ahead and deploy on your own, or you can basically tinker with them, which is what we suggest. That's our best practices. We suggest that you deploy in a sandbox what this sort of environment will look like, and then if you find that there's certain aspects of the policy or there's certain aspects of the code that you think need to be customized, which is almost always the case, then it's easy to do. You can easily go in and see the code. It's mostly JSON files that you can basically go in and see what you're looking for and make changes pretty easily to the policy.
Fascinating. I have the security question here too. How can intelligent automation enhance security and compliance in the cloud? And what considerations should organizations keep in mind to maintain a secure environment? Little bit in your wheelhouse, Sean. What do you think about that?
What can you do to maintain a secure environment? Disconnect it from the internet and hide it in a room with no one. No, that's not really an option, right? And so that used to be the joke that the only secure computer was the one that was locked away that nobody could touch, and that's right. No longer the case. And I think it's important to remember that Gartner, I think it was earlier this year, said that 99% of the breaches and attacks that we see on cloud workloads are because of mismanagement and misconfigurations. Miss and missed configuration.
And
that they're always, and that they're almost always 100% preventable. But you don't, and if you don't know if you don't know what's running out there and you can't see it and you can't monitor it, the average time to respond is 230 days. So, for example, with SolarWinds, we saw Sunburst, right? And Sunburst was a novel event that nobody ever thought would be possible, that you could get in and corrupt somebody's Azure DevOps pipeline and replace a certificate and get a password. But it happened, and it extended. And then we've seen bigger ones since then, right? Like that are constantly attacking critical infrastructure and healthcare and things that we rely on a day-to-day. So automation and machine learning and AI and being able to detect those drifts of what is normal traffic and what is anomalous traffic, and having machine speed ability to respond and remediate and notify is key. if you don't have security tooling in your cloud, especially as Ben mentioned multi-cloud strategy. A lot of people started out in the cloud and they opened their first account or their first Azure subscription with their first provider, and they just kind of ran with it. But now you have companies that have 20 and 30 accounts, or even an isolated account for every single person that works on that development team. And so I think that being able to observe it all is key. And if you don't have that tooling in place, you don't know what you're looking for, and you don't have automated response tooling to get in and fix things that can pick up as.
Hey, Sean, we're getting a little bit of a. We're losing you a little bit. Could you repeat?
Gone? Getting some feedback.
Yeah, we lost you a little
bit.
Where
did you lose me at? Yeah, so I think that my final point is, I guess where I'd go is the ability to respond at machine speed, right? Mm-hmm. Our brains and our fingers are not as fast as as a machine can be. And so being able to respond to anomalous traffic that AI has detected and machine learning can respond to and notify you that it's fixed will give you a great starting point to understand where you're going. And then having that incident response plan in place is also critical, and knowing how you're going to respond to the same event every single time and get the same results so that you can prevent these security events from taking you down. Did that answer the question?
Ben, did you have any thoughts on this? Bad? What's that say again?
Yeah.
No, go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, I did have one last thing to point out. I mean, there's a lot of things to talk about around security, absolutely. But I think one thing that I would really stress, especially as a best practice, is to enable MFA. MFA or multi-factor authentication is probably the most effective way to ensure that you don't go have a UPA. In fact, I think Microsoft did an analysis on this in 2020 where we found that 99.9% of all UPAs could be avoided if MFA had been enabled. And so that essentially, of the UPAs that were out there, unprotected access incidents, 99% of them were not using MFA. And so it's an obvious thing to go do. The question is, why not? Why have customers not or users not been using MFA today? A lot of it has to do with either unknowing or just not doing. It's just that. Because the fact is, MFA has become very, very easy to implement. In fact, right now with Entra ID or Azure Active Directory, there are two different ways to go about using a wizard to basically, you press a button to register yourself for MFA. It's that easy. And so actually what's happening, it's become such an issue, frankly, that Microsoft has, and we're just in the process of doing this, is we're rolling out managed conditional access policies for Entra ID, where administrators of Azure accounts will be enforced to use MFA going forward. So if you have security defaults already enabled, great. That usually means that you already have MFA you're already registered and enabled through MFA. But now we're also going to say that you need to have conditional access also applied.
Fascinating.
Yeah. I think zero trust is the big buzzword that we hear right now, but it has to become an operational reality, and you can't trust anything. Right? Like at the end of the day, we have to take the same level of care as with our cloud-based workloads that we would with our bank accounts and our healthcare information, and they enforce MFA. Right? Yeah. We can debate the methodologies and using SMS versus a password manager, but I think as Microsoft, Apple, and Google work really hard to start making MFA more of a commonplace thing and revisiting how we approach password management. You're going to see it become a lot easier. Like Ben mentioned, you can go turn on MFA and register your MFA provider real quick inside of the Azure AD and Entra infrastructure, right? If we could make it that easy as compared to what it was 2 years ago to go and implement Okta or another MFA provider, if we can make it 2 clicks, you're gonna get more people to adopt, and I think that's the key, and we have to just keep harping on the message. We have to have it. You have to protect your workloads the same way that we would protect our personal data.
Think that message is getting through?
Yeah, I do. I think as a lot more of these events take place, as people start seeing their healthcare records exposed and bank things and that critical infrastructure, I think that it is becoming more top of mind for even non-technical users and the business users to see the importance of why we need MFA when especially with emerging global threats, right? The state of the world right now is one where we hack first and launch bombs second. And if you can grab enough data, you can compromise anything. We saw that with SolarWinds. We saw that with Colonial Pipeline and some of these big events. And so I think that it's becoming more commonplace. And yeah, we get the letter every couple months that we've got another 2 years of free ID monitoring, but I think companies are starting to take it because, like with SolarWinds and the fallout from that, where the SEC is going after their CISO for not taking security seriously, I think you're going to put a lot of leadership on notice that now you're going to be personally responsible if you get hacked.
Yep. More skin in the game.
And yes, there should be a break glass for global admin.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was about to get to that exactly. And so with the point I was making about having MFA enforced, yes, MFA needs to be enforced. Is there and it will be by default. Can you turn it off? Is there a manual uncheck the box sort of function? Yes and no. It's going to be more and more challenging over the years over time to uncheck the box, but it will be one of those things where we as Microsoft will make that we'll have that capability. You'll be able to do that, and especially with managed conditional access, that particular policy allows for that sort of thing for a couple of reasons. One is if you're a partner, for instance, and have multiple tenants running within that you're managing, you'll want to be able to have that sort of capability of turning off MFA for certain things. The same goes for if you're a global admin that has multiple accounts that you are not necessarily, or you're delegating access to. Those are certain types of MFA scenarios that you also want to be able to turn off, or for which you want to turn off. But then there's just the general notion of what MFA means for a global admin. It really needs to be turned on. If you have an ID, like if you have an Okta or some other IDM, you'll probably want to be able to use that particular MFA feature within that IDM or ID provider. And so in that case, yes, you'll be able to turn off MFA from Microsoft. So those are all scenarios and various things that we'll make sure are included in the experience.
Fascinating.
I just want to add one more thing on the global admin thing. I get asked a lot, how do I secure my multi-cloud, multi-account, multi-subscription workload without having a break glass that has no MFA? My answer to that is always I use a token and I put that token in a safe, and the people who need to have access to that token can get access, right? It's either offsite in a safe deposit box, but there's never any reason and the cloud providers, if you set up your security response and work in partnership with your scalar providers, will always have some way that you can work around if you can't get to that token. And that comes down to having your incident response plan in place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, almost as important as security, and definitely maybe, more on everybody's mind in management is continuous optimization. And it's crucial for cost efficiency in the cloud. What strategies or methodologies should companies employ to continuously optimize their cloud estate as it grows? Maybe start with Sean. You're smiling, so.
Actually, that's not the one I wanted to push. This is the one I wanted to push.
Oh, there we go.
Azure is really powerful, but it can be complex. Manual administration, if you've ever clicked through the Azure console, and this is not a knock on Azure at all from their operations perspective, but we all know that the blades inside of Azure can get really daunting if you hit back in the wrong place, as I've learned many, many times. As containerization and Kubernetes becomes more popular, so does the need for the blend of the right instance families and sizes to ensure that your scaling plans are working correctly. And why would you manually manage your RI and financial agreements when you can automate the acquisition, compliance, and burn down, right? And yes, I work for Spot by NetApp. The Azure Marketplace does not offer a comprehensive enterprise-grade optimization scale-out solution other than Spot. But these are all things that you have to consider when it comes to that continuous optimization. And what is, at scale, trying to manage multiple control planes, multiple data planes, all inside of your estate, you have to be able to manage those nodes and have the right balance. And so best practices means understanding what your workload needs, when your services need a GPU, but then also having a strategy in place to automate the headroom, automate the scale out function so that you're not keeping servers warm when you don't need to, being able to call new restack all of those pods inside of the nodes so that you're getting the best performance from your node, right? If I can stick double the workload onto one single node that's slightly bigger that I pay a little bit more for, now my cost has really gone down per compute unit because I'm getting more optimal balance and I'm using 99% of the memory and the processor on there. So those best practices you can do by hand for one workload or 5 workloads, but when you get to 10 and 100 and they're all production level, keeping them working and optimizing again requires that AI and machine learning background to keep that optimization going.
Fascinating. What do you think, Ben?
I think there's a couple of approaches or methodologies that you can also apply to continuous automation. And there's tools that we can talk about as well. But I think one of the key areas of costs or continuous automation is going to be in the areas of things like scale sets, using scale sets for understanding how to consistently scale your environment with cost in mind. Along with the notion of, and this is what I should have said at the beginning, is you should have a governance model in place to start with. Like, you should understand what's critical. How do you go about determining what resources need to be added or not in an optimization scale? And then as you think about things like resiliency or things like security for resiliency, how do you think, where do those sorts of trade-offs or considerations take place as you think about the optimization of this workload? And this goes back to Sean's point earlier. This is where well-architected frameworks become really important because this is where you start to think about, okay, I need to optimize this workload, but what do I need to optimize it for? Am I optimizing it for resiliency? Am I optimizing it for security? Am I optimizing it for cost? And as you start to think about those optimizations or the things that you want to optimize for, what's the trade-off to those other sorts of dimensions or perspectives? Because it's at that point where the framework becomes really helpful, because the framework, those are best practices that will help you discern what those trade-offs may look like. Without you actually having to go through the pain, if you will, of determining how that particular workload is going to be impacted by another thing. So I would highly suggest looking at the the frameworks to start, because it'll be at that point where you can start to think about designing for optimization. The design for optimization takes into account the workload along with the underlying environment. And it's also going to take into account as things change, how do you affect that change? Like how do you adjust to that change? That's all part of continuous optimization.
Yeah. I hate to put you on the spot, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, developers have a tendency, especially the ones that I've worked with, to call the biggest infrastructure they possibly can, because they love their code right. And their infrastructure needs the most processor and the most memory. And then we turn it on and we start looking at the performance, and you're using 1/10 of one core and about 1 gig of RAM compared to the 64 that you've called. So putting guardrails in place during the build process and the deploy process will help you optimize and make that balance between costs. Because if you're optimizing just for cost, your performance is going to be impacted. Mm-hmm. If you're optimizing just for performance and you want your machine to, your application and your workload to scream as fast as possible, you're going to start impacting costs real quick. Like we've seen the horror stories of the bills. Mm-hmm. And so putting guardrails around the deploy process as well as your running infrastructure processes is just as important as everything that Ben said when it comes to the frameworks and thinking about it a little bit differently.
Fascinating. Do you guys have any examples of specific cost optimization initiatives that have yielded significant results for companies with rapidly expanding cloud footprints?
I mean, I can go on for hours about that, but do you have anything else top of your head before I jump in?
I haven't, for this particular project and Tech Talk, I went in and looked at some numbers just to kind of get a sense for like how customers are thinking about this and some studies along these lines. And what I found was that there was a really interesting Deloitte paper that was done. And what they did is they looked at 3 different cost optimization initiatives that basically describe the overall concept. So 1 is waste management, 2 is consumption management, and 3 is purchasing best practices. Mm-hmm. And so for waste management, essentially what they're talking about here is how do you eliminate unused or unutilized resources? So if you know something is idle, or if there's something orphaned, or there's an unattached IP address, how do you know where it is? That's the visibility aspect. And then how do you turn it off? Mm-hmm. So that makes up about 9%. So if you're able to turn these things off, you will save about 9% of your IT budget. In the cloud, that is. If you're to look at consumption actually is really interesting, because this is essentially where you're doing things like right sizing. So when you right size your environment or like your VM, for instance, what you're essentially doing is you're looking at how much traffic is this particular VM supporting, and should you consider something else? So right sizing is actually something that we make available as a tool within Azure under our cost optimization pillar and advisor, where it makes it really easy just to determine what you should actually be using as a VM. So it's really easy to do some right sizing there. You could also do things like leveraging spot instances, or you could be doing things like using auto scaling groups. Those are all consumption management oriented. And so the Deloitte study came out with, they said about 29% of these, you could save about 29% if you took into account consumption management. And then finally, the last one was around purchasing best practices. So purchasing best practices deals with things like reserved instances or savings plans. And so it's essentially knowing what kind of workload you have and what kind of environment in which you're going to run these sorts of workloads. And so if you can determine that you're actually going to be running this workload over a period of time or on some sort of continuous basis, then you could probably afford a reserved instance for that particular workload. And so that if you have that in mind, if you're planning correctly, you can save up to 15% on your bill just by knowing what that workload's supposed to do in that particular environment.
Wow.
And, I was looking up case studies in our customers because this is what we specialize in when I started. And I've seen companies that have shaved off 70% of their development and sandbox workloads because they were able to move everything to spot instances, like Ben mentioned. But having the automation in place to automatically identify some of that optimization. And if the graph that I'm showing right now, which is that what AKS infrastructure optimization at scale looks like, you see all the pods for the workloads in this demo environment, but then you see the Spot Ocean controller. And the Spot Ocean controller is our proprietary tool that was purpose-built with a partnership with the AKS team that we released in May, that basically is doing simulations of your workload every 30 seconds. And so every 30 seconds, we're constantly seeing what's the best way to optimize for your performance goals and your spend goals, and how can we best utilize those financial commitments that Ben talked about. And so being able to do that allows us to automate this process where we can go in and we can say, you really could benefit from switching your whole node and pod strategy to this slightly bigger one that's going to give you better density, or spinning off nodes that are spot instances, because we can report on the lifetime of those spot instances based on our historical usage and our partnership with Microsoft and some of the data that we have from the rest of our customer base. And so the key to optimization is there's no one way to go and track down all the waste. You need tools that can go in and say, hey, you've got all these snapshots that have been stacking up for the last 3 months that are just sitting there charging you money that you don't need. And so being able to automate the cleanup and identification is crucial when it comes to being able to optimize and get some of that spend in there.
Fascinating. I want to be sure we leave some time for some attendee questions, so I'll go right to my future question. Your prediction question is, how do you see the future of cloud ops evolving in response to the growing complexity of cloud ecosystems and the need for greater efficiency and optimization? I know, big question. Pull out your crystal ball. How about you, Ben?
I think there's a couple of interesting things about where cloud ops is going and the evolution of cloud ops. I think one of the important aspects, as you pointed out, is there's complexity that's just going to grow. It's just going to continue. And it's not just because there's more and more applications or more and more workloads moving to the cloud. It's also the fact that the environment itself, that Azure as a platform is getting more and more complex. And I mean, we went from, I think in 2012, there was about, I think 6 or 7 services. We're now over 300 services. And all of these services are meant to, interact in some manner. Some of them are going to be, just at the infrastructure level. Others are going to be at the platform level. Others are going to be at more of the ancillary or infrastructure or architectural level. And so knowing how to navigate the cloud is going to be one of those areas that you're going to need to know, and having best practices, having some of these frameworks that I've mentioned earlier. And one of the things that I hadn't mentioned earlier is our architecture center. The Azure Architecture Center basically has about 900 reference architectures that you can go look for and determine if this particular type of reference architecture meets your workload or relates to your particular workload. You can use that kind of as a backdrop to decide how are you going to use the cloud as it is. And then as the cloud evolves, as you think about your architecture and it evolves, making sure that your cloud operations concepts in using a lot of the things that we talked about today are ongoing, and that they're applicable, and that you have some future proofing as it relates to the way that particular architecture, that workload is going to work in the cloud, either just within Azure or across different types of scalars, or most of the time it's going to be an on-prem and cloud sort of environment. So I think there's a lot of complexity there. There's a lot of simplification that we would like to see. A lot of that sort of simplification is going to come from things like automation, a lot of the intelligent automation that Sean talked about.
Fascinating. Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah,
what do you
and I think
your crystal ball, Sean?
I think automation is going to become more key as response has to become quicker. We have to become more agile as we're working on stuff, and we're addressing the current state of the security, right? Securing workloads and the cloud is a team sport, so we have to shift left when it comes to security. I think that the everything ops is going to become more of a trend that we see, where we start to integrate more technical alignments into having that ops moniker, GitOps, DevOps, DevSecOps, right? We can go on for hours. And then I think Zero Trust and MFA and making sure that and those governance guardrails in cloud environments is going to become so paramount that every company is going to have to start thinking about it as we watch the fallout from some of these major breaches. And so security, automation, and AI. There's a reason every company in the cloud computing space is rushing to ship out AI products as fast as they can. Mm-hmm. It's the future. It's not to automate us out of jobs. It's to make us faster and more resilient. And so I think that that's the only way to do it.
Fascinating. Okay, that's all my questions. I want to be sure to get some questions from attendees. We don't have much time left, but we have enough. Let's start with Lynn, one of our favorite attendees. Hi, Lynn. Always ask intelligent questions. The question is, can you elaborate on best practices for provisioning, scaling, and optimizing infrastructure resources in Azure? When do you guys want to? Ben nodded. Does that mean you?
Yeah, I think there's some interesting things that I mentioned. Landing zone accelerators. I think that's one way to go about provisioning, scaling, and optimizing infrastructure specifically. There's also a new concept that we brought out, and I think it was maybe at Ignite or Build around deployment stacks. So a deployment stack is really interesting. It's similar to what we had with Azure Blueprints, where it's a really interesting way to utilize infrastructure as code and to do so in a GitOps manner or approach. Because effectively what you're doing is you're building in the infrastructure as you're building the code or as you're designing the code. And so it's a really interesting way for a developer to utilize a platform or an environment that has already been configured for your type of workload in a way that is holistic to that particular workload. So I think that sort of, if we go back to the question of, what do we see for the future? I think that's actually a really, really interesting area. One other reason that's interesting to me is it's not based on the subscription as much as it's based on the resource. And so resource management and the notion of resource becomes really, really integral in the way you go about deploying that particular workload. I'll stop there. Go ahead, Sean, if you like.
Yeah, I think when we talk about best practices, it comes down to your business functions, right? My best practices for my workloads is going to be a little bit different, but it comes down to that implementing automation, playing with and understanding what your workload needs, and then the landing zone concept. Before Microsoft came out and called them landing zones, I called them the vending machine, because I could go spin up and tear down an account or an Azure subscription on demand, and I could give my developers the ability to do that with their code while they were in test. We put guardrails around it where you could spin up a whole subscription, run your workload, see what it was doing, and then we would tear it down so that we would have that automation for provisioning and scaling in place. I think scaling comes down to understanding what your workload's going to do and how your application is going to do it. And while we're here, I want to push out one thing to the audience. We have a developer resource portal that we've built at NetApp. And if you visit the NetApp developer.netapp.com developer portal, right at the top, you'll see something that says Spot K8 Labs. And we have a lab for every single scaler where you can go and test the Spot tools and see how our automation works in a lab where you just kick it off and sign up for the free trial, and you can start today. And it takes 30 minutes to onboard the Spot from the marketplace. And we make that available. And we also have a Discord community that you can join where you can ask questions of our essays and some of our technical resources, not only from the cloud ops and automation side, but also the storage side. And so you can really tie together your hybrid and your cloud native environments together with these best practices.
That is an awesome resource. Thank you so much. So we've got one here. Maybe it looks like this might be our last one. Siva Sankar observes, well, it's a question. So no break glass for at least one global admin without MFA? Yeah. Not sure how this will be received.
Yeah, we kind of addressed that earlier in the session here. I do think, and Sean, I think you probably gave the best solution in how you go about dealing with something like this. You should have a no break glass policy. You need to have a way to access Azure in a way that doesn't necessarily require MFA, but this is related. I like the physical safe deposit. Yeah, exactly. That's it to Sean's point. Yeah. I'm going to. That's a great answer. I'm going to just stick with that.
I don't think you can have. We can't. The current state of cloud computing, the current role, the current importance of security. You can't have a break glass policy. A break glass policy is just leaving a door unlocked, and we all know that leaving back doors in just reduces your security posture. Have a security response plan in place. Have your leadership understand what that security response plan is. Work with your partners, right? If you are on these scalers, leverage the partnership aspect. Microsoft is really good about partnering with organizations that are either new to the cloud, coming in from that hybrid environment. I've worked with them on several different projects where if they know what your response plan is and they can keep track of it with you and help you guide it, they will give you ways to work around needing to have a break glass. You will need to have MFA. You will have, but there will be ways to disable it if you can verify who you are. Your mileage may vary depending on what your workload is. If you're government, I can't guarantee that. But from a commercial aspect, partnering with your scalers, leveraging that partnership and having them take an active partnership and communicative role will be huge in not having to have a break glass policy.
Okay, one more. I got to ask this question. This is from Tori. Of the three pillars you've discussed, which would be the one you'd recommend starting with?
Loaded question. The governance, understanding who has access, what's being run. You can't start anywhere until you know what you see, until you know what is running in your account and why it's running. Having that something as simple as a tagging strategy, adopting the FinOps practice. If cost management is your key driver, getting into FinOps, understanding the FinOps framework, the crawl, walk, run approach applies to cloud ops just as much as FinOps. And so I would say understand what you have and start putting your guardrails up, and then you can start working on optimization, and then you can start working on the automation.
Which pillar would you choose, Ben?
I agree. In fact, one of the things we hadn't talked about in this call this session was around the Cloud Center of Excellence. The Cloud Center of Excellence is the embodiment of governance, and if you don't start there, it's really hard to really plan it and a platform as a service as a platform landing zone. It becomes a really, really challenging thing if you don't know what your governance model looks like, especially for how it's going to apply to the cloud. And so with a cloud center or cloud center of excellence, you're essentially determining what that governance methodology needs to be, and then how are you going to go about enforcing and reporting on those policies.
Fascinating.
And cloud centers of excellence are really ways to get your management to buy in. If you can get the cloud center of excellence, it's easier to get that buy-in from your leadership instead of being the cloud island in the middle of the business.
Yeah, another indispensable resource. Yeah, absolutely. Gentlemen, that's all the time we have for this Tech Talk. I want to thank Sean Harris and Ben Brower for an informative conversation, and many thanks to the folks at NetApp for making this conversation possible. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.